Hey everybody, Robot here from Vespa, Motorsport, and ScooterWest.com. So if you're rebuilding a vintage Vespa, or maybe you have a new Vespa, and you're looking for parts and accessories, you know where to go, ScooterWest.com. We got you covered. So today I'm going to pull the motor out and disassemble this P200 motor. So in North America, they pretty much brought the P200 here from about 1977 to 1981. This is the top dog with the 200cc motor. Very similar motor to what came out in the Rally 200. So it's going to be a pretty quick hitting video. I'm going to show you some of the stuff that I'm going to do. I'm going to do a more of a quick and dirty pull the motor out style on this. And we're going to get it all apart. I'm going to make the job a little quicker if you have like an impact or some things you don't want to use impact, and I'll cover that as I go through the steps. So first step, you do want to drain the gearbox oil. Usually 11mm combo wrench will do the trick. So go ahead and allow that to drain. I usually like getting the cylinder and fan cover out of the way while we're at it. You may want to have some trays or organization started. If you're not familiar with these motors, I kind of know all the fasteners on them, so I can put them all in a pile. I'll probably be just fine. So spark plug cap comes off. Got a flat screw right here. This is going to be a little bit longer screw, along with the longer screw that also holds the selector box cover right there. So just past the spark plug is going to be a screw. If it's original, it's going to be a large flat screw. Sometimes it's a Phillips screw on the later models, or it's been replaced with a Phillips or a hex head. Sometimes that screw could be pretty tight. So I got a very large flat blade screwdriver. I'm going to put a monkey wrench on it. And spin that off, and typically it should have a wave washer. That wave washer is long gone, not there anymore. Lift the wires out of this little clip right here, and at this point you pull the cylinder shroud right off. Next, while we're at it, we'll get the tin for the fan cover off. Again, more flat screws. This is the other longer length one, so the two right here are a little shorter. They're about 10mm long. The longer ones are like, I think 16mm or 20mm long. And as you can see, if it's original, it's going to have a grounding wire for your CDI box. If the grounding wire is missing, the scooter typically will still run. It's just there for interference. So that pulls right off. You can see it's got the little clip there. If you're restoring a scooter, obviously replace this maybe, or you can clean it up and repaint it. And pull the little tin for the selector box right off. That's trapped underneath the fan cover. So here I'll get a 19mm socket on a nice impact right here. You can see the washer right behind. You're going to need the specific flywheel puller for a vintage Vespa. And if you're going to use an impact on it, make sure it's threaded all the way in there. Oftentimes there will be a lot of rust, so you may need to use a wire brush to clean that out. This one threaded in pretty nice and bottomed out. A lot of times you want to use that monkey wrench. And at this point, put that back, the 19mm, and flywheel's already popped. Normally they make a nice pop noise. So here's the nut for the flywheel. The star washer, I'd typically replace that. Part number 012555, I think. There's your Woodruff key. Looks to be in good shape. Part number 000267. You can keep all those together. Another little trick to keep them together, well, there's magnets inside your flywheel, so you could just put them right in there. Disconnect the battery, because on some models, such as this year of P200, there is 12 volts power at the stator plate. All right, so while we're looking at the stator, might as well disconnect some of the wiring. So you got the spark plug wire right here. This is typically a flat or a Phillips screw. It's kind of a flat-headed screw that pulls right out of this junction box right here. And you can pull these boots right off. This stator plate has been rewired And you go, a video we just published showed how to solder the wires and redo a stator plate. And this is the red wire. It's got some insulation. That would be actually hot, so you'd end up with some sparks if you're not watching right there. The neutral light switch is no longer present on the scooter. You may have extra wiring going to a neutral light here. That's no longer around. It does have one wire at the very last position of the CDI box, and that's your ignition kill. It comes from the ignition switch. So at this point, it's all separated, and you could put that right through the hook right there just to get it out of the way. That's what I've always done in the past. Next, we're going to lift the boot and pull the remaining 3 wires for the ignition system. You see they're all pretty tight. That's pretty important. If any of these wires were in pretty poor condition, some of these crimps aren't in the best condition. It's a good opportunity to replace them. And you can lift this little junction box right off. It's kind of got that little swage on the end of that little tube right there. Has a little bit of friction. Get that out of the way. Put those with your flywheel. Next up, we'll get the stator out of the way, just while we're here. It's kind of nice to work on much of the motor before you pull it out, because I kind of use the scooter as the motor stand. And whenever I rebuild an engine, or a P200 engine specifically, you don't really need an engine stand, is my experience. That screw, all these screws are a little bit rounded, so I'm certainly going to replace those. So here's something you may come across, a screw where the driver just cams out. Well, the first line of defense is to use an impact screwdriver. So essentially this has a bit on it. You can see it has tighten and loosen, and it has an insert bit already installed in there. And the idea is there's two directions. You can actually turn this. I'm going to turn it counterclockwise, like I'm unscrewing the screw. You hold this with your hand, and the idea is when you give it some taps, it will cam the screw out. And had no problems starting that screw. That's all it needed. And obviously I wouldn't recommend using that screw again. Just give it a small tap. You don't want to really wail on this. Pull that screw out. And I see the same situation here too, where the screw cams out. We're going to throw that out. Another way to remove a screw where you could easily get access to it is have a really nice set of pliers. And these are actually specifically Nipex pliers. They have a nice bite to them and a lot of leverage. And a lot of times you could just turn, get a grip on the head of the screw and break it free. And I'm not having much luck there. Let's try the impact screwdriver. This screw head is in pretty bad shape. And probably the last, I'm not going to show it today, well hopefully I don't have to use it. I'd actually take a grinder and grind a slot into the screw. But obviously that made easy work of it right there with that. You could take a cutoff wheel and just cut a slot and then use a flat blade screwdriver. A lot of times you get a lot more force on a screw that's where the driver is camming out. Before I even remove this, you could see there's an IT mark. On some of them, they'll have an A mark, and there's also a casting little pip right there. The A mark is for about 23 degrees. The IT mark, I think, is about 18 degrees. So the A mark for 23 degrees is for what you'd usually set up a stock P200 cylinder. And sometimes these aren't accurate, so when I build the motor, I'll show how to time the motor accurately. But if you're unsure, I would make a mark. A lot of times a Sharpie is not going to be a very good mark. You could take a punch and just make 2 pin marks. I'm not too concerned because when we rebuild this motor, we're going to actually use new engine cases. So we're going to set it up from scratch. Flywheel just pull right off. You can see the wiring's in really nice shape on this stator. Pull the wires through here. The seal looks to be in good shape, but anytime I take apart a motor, I'll replace all the seals, all the gaskets, and typically the shifting cross. And be prepared for some washers to fall out. So there's an inner washer, outer washer, and there's also a spacer in there. Typically you'd also have a spring washer. Those are long gone, but we'll replace those when we reassemble this. Again, the inner washer. And sometimes just to stay organized, you can partly reassemble items. Typically, if I know the motor, I'll put everything in one bin because I want to clean all the hardware. But we'll set that aside. We know it was working just fine. So the gear oil is pretty much all drained. I let it drain for quite a bit of time. I'm going to take an 11mm socket. We're going to get the selector box out of the way. You could cut the cables and leave the selector with the engine, but typically a lot of rebuilds, the easiest thing to do is leave the cables all intact and remove the selector box. But if you had shifting issues, this scooter didn't have any shifting issues. There's all the hardware for the selector box, same as all this case hardware. You'd want to check to make sure this little arm doesn't have any wobble or free play in it. It's draining a little bit more gearbox oil in there. I went ahead and this little clamp right here, you just open it up. It's like a little steel clamp that holds the pair of cable housings. And I pulled the selector away, it's dripping some oil. Then I'm gonna go up to my shifter, pretty much just kind of push the selector away from the motor here. Sometimes I get a little bit bound up. Just kind of give it some wiggles. You can see it's already all the way in 4th gear right there. I did turn the shifter down, if you're wondering which way, you know, towards 4th gear. It originally was in neutral, because that's how I wheeled the scooter up here. So, and once you're to the 4th gear, it will disengage this little paw. So this is what you want to check for. See how that has some free play in there? I'm probably gonna redo that pin, because that free play is actually not a good thing. Or you could just replace the whole selector box. That could cause misshifts or it not to hold the gear. Obviously this gasket's not really reusable, so I'll keep that in mind when rebuilding the motor. There's still a little bit of oil still left in this. We could have got the Kickstarter out of the way, but a lot of times I like leaving the Kickstarter on there because it makes it nice and easy to handle the motor when you're pulling out. So we'll set that aside. The cables come out of here. Cable housings are in pretty questionable shape. It may be worth replacing them. I know it shifted pretty nice, so probably not going to replace them on this scooter since we're concentrating on replacing the engine cases. Another thing to check is to see if that turns. Right now the wheel's on the ground, it's not going to turn, but sometimes those will come loose out of the motor and that causes misshifts. So the next thing I'd get out of the way is the muffler. It's pretty difficult to pull the motor out with the muffler in place. And you can completely service the top end with the motor completely, bolted in. So I'm going to go ahead and loosen the clamp right here. There's a clamp that goes onto that steel spigot that threads into the cylinder. Next, I'm going to get a 17mm combination wrench and loosen the bolt. I'm not going to remove it all the way. So on the left side of the scooter, you want to get the spare tire out of the way. 2 to 3 bolts are going to hold that in place. And now I can access the muffler bolt. I can see it's missing a lock washer. And at this point, you can't pull this bolt all the way out with the tire in place. And then we'll move back to the other side and knock the spigot off. So I'm back on the right side of the motor. We're gonna knock this muffler header off the spigot of the cylinder. Usually you wanna do it with a chisel. It typically won't work its way off. The original exhaust pipe will have a nice weld. This is an aftermarket exhaust right here. So it does have a spring clamp, so you can do with that, and then once you have it down enough, you can, and then it will just drop right off. You can also do that with a large flat blade screwdriver, one that you don't care about. The spigot does unscrew from the cylinder. There's like a slot on it. We're not going to take that off. So both cowls are off the scooter, spare tires out of the way. I usually like to get this plastic or rubber bumper out of the way. Oftentimes they'll snap off. Sometimes they do have clips that retain these two pegs. It gives you this nice little notch that will make it much easier to remove the tire. So I had the front of the scooter clamped. I didn't really show that step. I've showed how to make a makeshift like work table. You could put this up, a scooter like this up on a workbench. That's what I used to do before I had a lift, and fabricate some sort of clamp, maybe using tie downs to support the front of the scooter. Obviously a nice shop lift makes the job go nice and easy. But I have the scissor lift right here, and we sell these at the Scooter West web store. This is a pretty decent one, and I have it on the very tail of the frame. It is also possible to put it underneath the motor, and the idea here is I just want to lift the tire. And there's going to be 5 bolts, usually 13mm socket, to get the wheel out of the way. Another option is just to deflate the tire, and you're able to get the muffler bolt just past the deflated tire. And right now you can see the tire doesn't want to spin, and if you could actually just move that shaft a little bit and get it in one of the false neutrals. Keep in mind there's a bunch of lock washers that usually are with the wheel. This is a tubeless wheel here, so we'll make sure we get those all out of the way. So the tire, obviously you can't really pull it past the rear of the frame with that jack in the way, but I want to get the muffler out of here. So go and do that. I already have it loose. It should have a lock washer, but it doesn't. So go ahead and slide the muffler out of the way. There's the large bolt that holds the muffler in place. So at this point, we'll get the rear of the scooter as high as we can get it. So pretty much that's as much as the jack's gonna go, and that's about the limit of where we can get it on the center stand. So the center stand's gonna be part of our stand to hold the scooter in place. You could also have somebody help you, like kind of pull the rear of the frame up. So we have it up on the center stand, and then we can get the jack out of the way. So at this point, we'll be able to kind of slide the tire past the hub and the rear of the frame. Of course, it's a little easier if you deflate the tire. So it does kind of bind up. And go ahead and set that out of the way for now. All right, so I'm gonna move on to the airbox and carburetor, oil pump. Flat screwdriver, I'd like to get this out of the way. It is possible to leave the airbox in place, but when you're doing this job all by yourself, I tend to like to get all this stuff out of the way. So pop the airbox cover lid off. Is what I like doing, is using the airbox lid as a little hardware tray. Get the air filter out of the way. Flat blade screwdriver does the trick. And obviously make sure the fuel's off. Those pieces of hardware lift the air filter right off. So a couple things we'll do before we pull the carburetor. I like getting a flat blade screwdriver. This is your choke cable. Go ahead and actuate the choke by getting a flat blade screwdriver in between there. I don't have a needle nose on me. Sometimes I use a needle nose to disengage that cable. It's actually a solid piano wire style cable. Go ahead and pull the cable out. Same goes with this rubber gasket, just pulls right off, get it out of the way. And you can see this oil pump right here. And if you just pull the lever a little bit, we're able to disengage the throttle cable. So that little barrel pops out, and then you're able to pull the throttle cable out. Looks like we got a little bit of housing there. We'll deal with the hose in a moment. This rubber air intake accordion just pulls right off like that. And we have a fuel line. A lot of times I do like just taking off from the banjo. We're gonna go ahead and loosen it. It's got a worm gear style clamp. And hoses are always hard to pull off. If the hose is really, really hard, you may just wanna cut it off or cut the hose and replace it instead of fight with the hose. But this hose still seems fairly supple and I'm pushing it down. Another option is just go ahead and pull the banjo right here. It's not leaking gas, which is a good thing. So we'll go ahead and pull that off. And that little thing, so that pulls right off. Get the hose clamp out of there. We'll go ahead and pull the throttle open. I want to make sure I get the rotary valve closed. And you could, without the flywheel, it's a little difficult, but sometimes I'll turn that over until you can see it close up. And that's just a good safety measure. And you get your 11 millimeter. And this kind of go between the two bolts. You don't really want to warp your carburetor body. The much newer ones, they actually have a large Allen bolt that threads all the way into the case. It's actually a better design. You can always upgrade to that style. Maybe we'll do that with the new engine cases. So go ahead and loosen both these sleeve nuts, as they are, or bolts, or whatever you want to call them. And at this point, the carburetor should just lift right out. Sometimes you end up with the mixer screw. You may need to pull that out if it's extra long on a newer style carburetor. So we have the carburetor out of there. It's got the flat washer, the split washer. We'll leave that all with the carburetor there. You can pull this fuel line out. Comes out of that grommet right there. Still in pretty good shape, nice and soft. And oftentimes, if it is leaking just a little bit, you can put one of the bolts in. You know, this is from the air filter. You can tighten the clamp down, but it shouldn't be leaking if your fuel tab's working. There's gonna be a little bit of fuel that's gonna come out. Then we'll pull our oil line off. And just like the fuel line, you kind of want to push it off. And that's going to be the most effective way to remove that hose. And typically, this is going to want to leak oil. So go ahead and just shove a bolt in there, and that will keep it from leaking much of the oil. So there's one more thing you got to do to get this gasket, or this whole airbox off. Pull that gasket. We're going to throw all those gaskets away. Just to show what you're looking for, see how the intake's open right there? I want to close it up so you don't see, you see the rotary valve has closed up that intake. And I'm just doing that as a safety measure. A lot of times I'll take it a little further. Once I get the airbox out of the way, I'll put a piece of duct tape over the intake hole. So, you know, if you accidentally drop that screw in there, at least you'd see it sitting on top. So just rock that airbox right off. And this makes it so much easier to pull the motor out when the airbox isn't in place. Another thing I've done in the past is I've actually used this gasket and made a blank gasket that sits over top of this intake. Go ahead and pull that oil pump gear out. Leave that with all your other bits from the airbox. So the only thing that's holding this motor into frame are the pair of bolts, and there's also a rear brake and a clutch cable that we're going to go ahead and disconnect. So here is your clutch cable housing, and the clutch cable leads to this little arm right here, and then there's a barrel clamp. So you're going to need 8mm wrench, combination wrench on the outside or the larger part of the barrel, and then the actual little screw is a 7mm. Go ahead and loosen this, and you'll see the clutch cable should disconnect. Sometimes it will be stuck. Just go up there and pull your clutch and it will usually pop. And a lot of times it's just worthwhile just replace the cable, because anytime you tighten these clamps onto the cable, usually the cable is damaged. It may be frayed anyway, so you're going as far as rebuilding the motor, you might as well sometimes just replace the cable. So the little barrel just pulls right off. Set that aside. And at this point, clutch cable housing can pull out of that adjuster. And as you can see, the cable's like a little bit kinked, so it's even really hard to get out of that adjuster. So it may be worthwhile just replacing this cable when we have the motor out. So another thing I like to remove is the cable adjuster. Very easy to break that off. It's very fragile. So go ahead and just remove the clutch cable adjuster from the engine case while it's still up in the frame, because the moment you let the motor drop, you'll end up breaking that off. It's not very fun to remove it. And I'm making a little hardware pile. Like I said, if you're unfamiliar with these motors, you may want to stay organized with little bags or trays. But typically I'll take all the hardware and clean it all in one thing. So here's your brake cable. Go ahead and disconnect it from that little clip right there. And go ahead and get a 13mm socket. Go right on the rear brake right there. And this cable is a lot more sturdy, and you typically can reuse the rear brake cable. And if you're doing a rebuild, say you're just doing a shifting cross job only, it is possible just to pull the cylinder and pull this half of the case, leave the motor bolted in. And if that was the case, I'd probably leave this rear brake cable still connected, but we're going to pull the whole entire engine case out. So at this point, the two last control cables have been disconnected. So typically the nut on the back side, this is actually a 9mm bolt, a very unique size bolt for the shock. And it's 14, in this case it's 13. So got a 14mm wrench on the bolt itself. And when you get the motor out, you want to check the upper shock mount. It's actually rubber, and they do fail over time, and that could add for a difficult situation. I can see there's incorrect installation. There's a washer. That washer actually should be on the side with a nut, but we'll deal with that when we're ready to pull the motor all the way out. So the next step is we have a large bolt right here. I'm going to take my impact with a 22mm socket and zip that bolt. So I got both this pretty thin nut and this large lock washer off from this side. And at this point, I could take a hammer and give it a couple taps on the actual engine pivot bolt. We'll move back to this side. The motor's fairly light now that we got some of the accessories off of it. So go ahead and lift the motor from the bottom. You could also use your scissor jack. So there's that special bolt. There's the 9mm lock washer. We'll keep that all separate because it's the one unique size bolt. And at this point, you can use the Kickstarter to kind of help support the motor. And at that point, you're gonna have to kick it down just a little bit. And just be prepared for the motor to want to drop. So I'm kind of in the way. So I kind of was keeping it from crashing down and pulled the bolt out. So now the motor's separated. All right, so the reason I'm leaving the Kickstarter on there is a nice little handle. Another place to pick it up is from the swing arm right here. And I would say it weighs like maybe 75 pounds. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and start the disassembly of the motor. First of all, we'll get the cylinder off. Like I said, you could do that while it was still in the frame. If you're just servicing just a top end, or maybe you just want to go inside the engine, split the cases to do a shifting cross, that is possible. I'm just getting the spark plug out of the way. It's a fairly fresh spark plug. Next, we'll get the 13mm socket. You're going to take the spacer off. So there's 4 head studs with nuts on them. So I'm just going to crack them free. So pretty much turn them an 1/8 to a 1/4 turn. There's still a little bit of tension on them. And at this point, we'll loosen them the last little bit. Probably can just, at this point, they're all about hand height, or it's just a The actual split washers are holding the, there's the last one. There's gonna be some washers that come off with this. Go ahead, tip the head and you get all those flat washers. So we got the spark plug, the spacer, the 4 nuts and all the washers that hold this head in place. You can see it kind of blows by a little bit. That's pretty normal. Oftentimes we'll decoke the head, get all that carbon out of there, and we may lap the head to make it perfectly flat again. So at this point we can pull the cylinder away. Oftentimes I'll leave the piston partly in there. This job's much easier than when this engine's in the case. So we'll pull both of the clips out, pull this side, go ahead and dispose of that. We'll replace that 16mm clip if we're going to reuse a piston, or a new piston would come with a new clip. Those are actually installed in the incorrect orientation, I could tell. They may have rotated around. So with these circlip pliers, go ahead and squeeze down and pull that clip out. And you can use a round socket that happens to fit in there, or you could just use an extension. And just little taps. You don't want to wail on this. Just enough to get the pin out. And that's why I'm leaving the piston partly in the cylinder. And now it's disconnected from the connecting rod. So we'll go ahead and pull this out. We'll look at that a little bit later. There's going to be a wrist pin bearing right there. Go ahead and set that just like that for now. Dispose of this gasket because we'll replace that. And we're going to go ahead and spin the motor around. So this is the back side. So the little cover is already missing. We're going to go ahead and get the cotter pin out. This is a much older style motor. The newer motors have a different setup, much like the modern Vespa. It's like a little castle that goes over the nut. A little better design, but these older style, they use this special type of nut here. And oftentimes I like using diagonal pliers just to lever this cotter pin out. Sometimes you're going to have difficulty getting it out, and feel free to cut it. You're definitely not reusing this cotter pin, but kind of using it to lever it out. You can throw that part away. Next we'll take our 22mm socket. If it is the later motors and EFL motors, which I think started in 1985, it would be a 24mm socket. Impact makes nice quick work of that. And go ahead and pull the hub off. This motor doesn't have any of the gear oil. We took care of that because you got to watch out when you pull the hub off, it would leak gear oil out of that. You have this large thick washer in there, and that nut, we'll set that aside. Next we're going to go ahead and get the brake shoes out of here. And it's kind of not the best tool for this, but it happens to work the best. And if you distort the spring, you may want to just replace that. I kind of levered that out of that hole. Another option I've showed in my prior videos, you can actually break these off. Probably want to reuse these brake shoes. So I just left the spring there. May want to replace that spring since I did use diagonals to lever it off, but that happens to be one of the easiest ways to do it. These little Omega clips, again, diagonal pliers work really good because they kind of bite. I'm not squeezing so hard that I'm going to cut these little clips. But go ahead and pull the shoes off, and we'll set that aside. A lot of times just go ahead and replace the brake shoes. So we got this backing plate for the brake. And there's 3 little self-tapping Phillips screws that go into the engine case that hold this in place. And pull those out. Then that separates. You have these old O-rings. You can get rid of all this stuff if you want right now. They all pull off. There's O-rings in 3 different spots. And I'm just using whatever tool I have handy just to kind of pry at it. Next, we're going to go ahead and get the clutch bell off. You're going to take a 10mm socket. It may have been a good idea to pressure wash the motor a little further before we take it apart, but I'm going to clean all the parts individually. And as you can see, there's a flat and a split washer. You may want to replace those washers, or if the bolts are in bad condition, but there's your bolts that hold that in place. And you can just give it a little pry right here and it will pop that cap right off. No wonder why the clutch was very smooth on this scooter. It's got a Koza clutch, I'll show you that. This little piece, oftentimes you may want to replace it. It sets in just like that, and this arm does come apart as well. Actually, I'll go ahead and just take everything apart since we want to clean everything. So I got a little flat blade screwdriver. I'm going to go ahead and chip that O-ring out of the way, dispose of that. And to take this apart, just get a flat blade screwdriver and pop the spring over that aluminum peg right there. And this is the return spring for your clutch. Go ahead and pull the clutch arm out. As you see, there's an O-ring right there. The spring, that O-ring sometimes can be a little bit of a bugger to get out, so you may want to just get a knife in there and cut it out. Go ahead and dispose of that. We're going to clean all those parts. And the last little piece is this little arm right here. For right now, I'll put all the pieces in this little clutch belt, like it's a little storage bin. So we're at the clutch right here. This is referred to as the Koza clutch. The Koza is a Vespa that they came out with in the 90s. And they came out with a new design clutch that has a much lighter feel. Some would argue if it's an improvement or not, but it definitely works really nice on a stock motor in its stock form. They have a very nice clutch feel, much lighter than the stock clutch, and they don't have as many of the abnormalities that the original clutch had. So this has been changed, and I'll show you the differences. We're going to go ahead and remove this pressure plate, and you kind of want to get a flat blade screwdriver in there and just carefully lift up. The clip may go flying, so go ahead and pry that up, and I'm doing that from the larger hole. If this was the original clutch, it would be smooth. It'd have 7 little dimples for spring pockets on there, and you'd be looking down in the well. You would see something that looks like that, and you see a nut that looks like this. And typically one of these tabs would be folded over into one of these slots. So you use a pretty thin screwdriver, you'd fold that tab flat so you're able to get the original clutch tool. The original Scooter West part number on this is tool CN, and it engages with this part. Another useful tool is you can lock up the clutch by engaging it into one of these slots and putting one of the screws in there, and you're able to use a hand tool. But oftentimes with this clutch tool, it can handle an impact wrench. You can put a 17mm socket on there and put a lot of pressure with an impact, and you could zip that nut right out of the way. When you reinstall it, it's pretty important that you torque it to the proper spec, but just showing what a stock original P200 clutch is. I wasn't expecting there to be a Koza clutch in here, which uses a different style. So we're going to go ahead and get a 19mm socket on there. And you can see it's kind of got distortions, those 3 distortions on the end. That's what actually makes it lock up onto the crankshaft. They work very well. They don't really come loose. You see there's quite a bit of friction on there. Sometimes when you reinstall this, we'll put some Loctite on there. And at this point, sometimes you just pull the clutch right off. Just rocking it off. If you can't get it off, usually you could use 2 flat blade screwdrivers and carefully lever it off. You may want to use 2 to 3 of them. Some of the older motors actually had a tool that allows you to pull the clutch off. They have a clutch puller tool for the, some of the models. So there's also a washer in there. I'll get that out of the way. You can see the Woodruff key is right in there. The part number on that Woodruff key is 000097. And we'll go ahead and carefully dig that out, just get that out of the way. Still looks to be in really good shape. Set that with the pressure plate. And then there's a gear that engages the oil pump that also removes. You can see the thickness of this. Different motors sometimes use a thinner version of this if they don't have the oil pump. There is a spacer that goes here if you don't have the oil pump. With those same circlip pliers that we remove the piston pin clips, we'll go ahead and reverse them so they work for not an internal clip but an external clip, so they expand just like that. So when I squeeze it, they open up. And there's a little clip right here. We'll go ahead and get that in between there and carefully open that up and pull that little clip off. I'm setting all these parts with my clutch. There's going to be a thrust washer, so be prepared for a thrust washer to fall off on the top and an identical part on the bottom. And get those out of the way. With these older motors, they use these two clamps here. Those steel parts aren't available. You could suffice with red Loctite. That works pretty much just as well. So while we're still on the subject of the clutch, we'll go ahead and disassemble the clutch. So you'll need this specific tool called Tool CC, and it has this little shaft. It works with different style clutches, whether you have the small frame clutch that uses kind of a different setup. This is actually the factory original clutch tool that we've been using for years. Put that thick washer on there and then spin the wing nut. Just give it a couple turns, give it a little tap. You can see the plate drops down. You're going to find a slot for this clip right here. And you may want to use a needle nose or something. Obviously be careful that this clip doesn't go flying. So go ahead and disengage the clip, just like that. There's actually a sharper edge of the clip. That's the side that goes outside. At this point, you just drop the clutch and it drops all its guts out. This is a Koza clutch, so it's built a little different. There's going to be a thrust washer that's pretty similar to the original clutch, and also this bronze bushing. They both look to be in really good shape. I've covered in the past on how to overhaul a clutch. Everything looks really nice in this clutch, so we're going to leave it all alone and in the order that it was all assembled. On the Koza clutches, I do find they sometimes eat the ears because they have more plates than the original clutch. You have an extra steel and an extra cork plate versus the stock one. They are different parts for this style of clutch. This is engineered more like what you find in a traditional motorcycle. And if you release this, you're going to reveal the springs that are located in the center hub, which is very different than the original clutch that would have been on this era or earlier Vespa. So this is what if you were taking apart a later PX, like I think maybe 2000, in the 2000s and later, somewhere in there, this is what it would look like. And there's this little center part here, and you have all the inner springs. The later ones have larger springs on the outside. I'm gonna leave this all apart because we're gonna go ahead and clean it. There's a lot of gooey stuff in there. Definitely worth cleaning that. We'll set that aside for now. So I had the motor flipped upside down, just happens to work a little easier. The first one to get out of the way is the one that's underneath the Kickstarter. I like to leave the Kickstarter in place because it helps with splitting the engine cases and also with assembly. So go ahead, get this little bracket out of the way. All the washers are all going to be the same. I'm using an 11mm socket, and I'll kind of just do it in a crisscross fashion. And all these center studs, they're actually fixed with the engine case. All the outer studs are actually removed from these engine cases. So, and while I'm at it, I'll go ahead and remove the fill bolt. It normally would be a flat screw on if it was the original part, but it's actually 11mm. So I'm setting all this stuff in its own little pile. Oftentimes I replace all the hardware. Hardware looks to be pretty nice, like in good condition, but a lot of those, the nuts, the washers, usually I'd replace all those parts. And oftentimes this stud right under here is pretty difficult to get out. We'll deal with that at a later time. And then you have one last stud that we're going to go ahead and flip the motor over. So once you know 11 of the nuts are out of the way, you want to take some sort of soft face hammer or mallet would work. If you have a nylon face mallet, that would do the job. This is a brass face. There's a little pry spot right here. This is typically where they'll hang up, because not because of the silicone that's going to be added, but there's a pin that goes all the way through. If it doesn't break free right here, I would suggest taking a punch, heating this area up and driving the pin through, but the pin isn't rusted. And at this point, you carefully tap in some of the other spots. They're a little more fragile, but usually the most important spot to give some taps is right there. And at this point, I use the Kickstarter, and a couple things sometimes hang up the case. I'm holding the Kickstarter down and then it will finally release. So you'll see the spring that will come right out right there. You have the kickstart gear. Typically I'd always replace that part. And we can dispose of this old gasket here. On these later motors, this part isn't cast in. There's a plastic little oil deflector. It's pretty important that it stays in place and you put it back. And while we still have the soft face hammer, we'll go ahead and tap the crankshaft through. And you do not want to hit on the end of the crankshaft. There are tools that will push the crankshaft through, but typically if you just put the nut several turns onto that and hit it with a soft face hammer, I'm supporting the crankshaft. Doesn't take much force to pop it out of the bearing on the clutch side. So we'll go ahead and pull that out, kind of supporting the crankshaft. We'll set that aside and look at it a little bit later. So before we knock the main axle out, we're going to go ahead and take the gears out. It is possible to knock this out with the gears still on the axle shaft. So I'm using another external circlip plier, a larger size one. And just carefully lever that off. I'm not stretching it too much. You can reuse this, but if you stretch it out or bend it up, it may be worth replacing. We have the shim gear. For the shim, first gear, second gear, and I'm keeping track of the order. I'm stacking them in the order that they go in, and then you kind of got to get them past, line up those notches to get it past the selector box. If this was a newer gearbox, there'd also be a shim, one more shim on the inside. And at this point, I went ahead and thread the axle nut on the end of the the axle shaft for the wheel. And I'm supporting the axle as I'm hitting it with a saw face. And we're almost all the way through. We'll come back to that part there. And the last gear left is the intermediate shaft, or I like to call it the Christmas tree, because when we pull out, it kind of looks like the little Christmas tree. So on this nut right here, there's a tab washer. You can use a little flat blade screwdriver and knock the tab over. Sometimes they have 2 tabs left, or some. The 125 150's got a smaller nut, like a nut. You use a 14 millimeter wrench. This one's got a 17 millimeter. Make the job easy, we'll use the impact. And it looks like somebody used a little bit of Loctite on here. So since there's a little bit of Loctite on there, we want to protect that machine surface of the axle shaft. I'm just going to squeeze this just enough that we'll be able to all right. Somebody put some Loctite on there. Normally I don't put Loctite on that just because of that reason alone. You end up having to support it. You got that little special washer there, and then you got the locking washer. And I know this locking washer is trash because the little tab that would support this little axle here has been sheared because there was Loctite on the threads. That's not something I normally would put right there. The next little surprise you're going to run into is you're going to have 21 little needle bearings that are loose. They're going to drop out of this shaft. So you can kind of capture them. You put a little bag on the end of the shaft. I'm kind of holding that there, and then I'm going to carefully tap this. And all those needle bearings are just going to want to drop off. There's 21 of them if you want to count them, and I just captured them in the bag. At this point, we could drop this off. See that bearing right there? Again, you can use the circlip pliers. This bearing feels really nice. They usually last quite a long time. But if you're completely going through a motor that has high hours or has bearing noises, it may be worth replacing that. Same with this cush drive. I don't see any signs of this plate swelling, so I suspect it's in really good shape. In the past videos, I have showed how to rebuild this cush drive. There's actually little springs in here that dampen the shifting action from the engine and the crankshaft. But this one, just looking at it, it's nice and tight. The plate has no bowing. I don't see any reason to rebuild this cush drive right here. So the next step, I'm going to go ahead and get all the seals out. This has the newer style metal seal. Pretty much any of these seals, if you're knocking them out, they're pretty much done. You'll replace them. And I want to get a flat blade screwdriver at a very shallow angle, just between the bearing and the seal, and give it a twist, and eventually we'll pop the seal out. That seal is a little more difficult. Definitely stays in place a lot better with that metal. And then look at your seal on back here. This has got a 30 millimeter, a 30-47-6 seal, so it's got the larger size drum. The original drum that would be on this era scooter would be a 27 millimeter. So somebody's replaced the rear drum. It's got the larger size seal. So make sure you use and order the correct seal, and the numbers are usually imprinted right on that seal. Here's the flywheel side seal. Again, I'm kind of levering a flat blade screwdriver, a pretty large one, between the seal and the case. And if you have difficulty getting it, you can actually flip the case over. Use that same flat bladed, pretty large size flat bladed screwdriver. There is metal in that rubber seal. And you just give it a couple taps and it will drop right out. And typically, anytime you take apart one of these motors, you just replace all those parts. And we're here with the Kickstarter. Sometimes this nut may be pretty trashed, especially if the bike's, the scooter's going down. See if we can get a 13 millimeter on it. And definitely not going on there on the close or open end. If that's the case, we'll go ahead and use something like this Nipex pliers and obviously replace these parts that are damaged before putting the Kickstarter back on. And we'll go ahead, lock that up. Yeah, there's quite a bit of friction. I would probably replace the kickstart bolt. I think the kickstart is still in good shape. Those little splines look like they're in decent condition. If this was in really bad shape, I'd probably just take a cutoff wheel and cut the nut right off. So, but I think it's still, we'll be able to twist it off. It's pretty close. And if it was in good shape, you'd just be able to use a socket on there. Get rid of the lock washers. And tap it off. And at that point, kind of reveals the crack. I don't think the camera's gonna get it, but there's a crack right there, and that's where the oil was leaking. So there's two ways to get this kickstart gear out. You can give it some taps, and it will usually just pop right out, along with the spring. And you can see the spring kind of engages with that. Usually all this is in pretty good shape. The reason you may want to replace the kickstart gears, sometimes they're bent. If it was very difficult to get out, it's likely bent, this shaft here, from prior crashes. It could get damaged. As for looking for that crack from this end, I could see the camera's not going to pick it up, but I could see a crack that goes from about here all the way to here across the case. So believe it or not, the oil is pretty readily will weep through that crack, and that's what it's coming out of that crack on the other side. So if somebody was going to fix this case, they'd have to grind this whole entire crack out, and then they would TIG weld it. You'd probably have to grind it flat so it's up against that machine surface. It's quite a bit of work, and to do it successfully, you got to be a pretty accomplished welder with experience welding aluminum castings. So it's definitely not something easy to do. These little rubber things, they just pop right out. Those are the stops for the Kickstarter. They get pretty hard over time. I just recommend replacing them. And we'll put that in our parts list. Those have been used on the Vespas for quite a long time. That's the one it rests against all the time. When the Kickstarter is resting, that's usually the more worn piece. And you have the needle bearing for the flywheel side. On this half, you have a small needle bearing right here that supports the axle shaft. So a couple more things we'll go ahead and take apart on the larger half of the engine case. The way these old bearing retainers worked is they had these folded over tabs. Those tabs are no longer available. So if you damage them, you could suffice with just red Loctite. And we'll go ahead and tap the tabs over, just like that. And use an 11mm socket to get the two nuts off. Same nuts that hold the case together here. So the little tabs sometimes get caught up on the threads, so may need to pry them out of the way. These are only found on the much older motors. On the later motors, they actually cast in the stop, or they have a clip in some cases. Get those out of the way. So you can see they're kind of just in pretty bad shape. If they were in good shape, they would just pull right off and not be hammered onto the thing. And then you have the little bearing retainers, and they should be pretty flat. You can still get those parts. And it is possible to kind of hammer them back into shape. So the other thing I want to take apart is the rear brake cam. I do see one error. Somebody never put the cotter pin. There'd normally be a cotter pin that would go right through this hole right here. That's not there, so it just never was put back in place. And we'll go ahead and fold that up where it disengages from that little lever arm, and should be able to pry this out, especially since the cotter pin's not there. Obviously you got to remove that cotter pin if it is present. There's a couple O-rings that you could pull off the shaft. And there's a little well, like a slotted well that holds grease. So those are all your parts. We're gonna go ahead and clean those all up. These bushings are all removable as well. I'll show that at a later time, how to service those bushings. So go ahead and take the rear brake cable adjuster that is on threads, 11 millimeter, 10 millimeter in some cases. Go ahead and separate that. Let me show you how to remove the bearings again. So we have our larger size circuit pliers set up to extract internal clips. And carefully just pull that out. And as you can see, there's a little distorted. That's something I'll probably replace. It shouldn't be all wobbly like that. Flip the motor over. We have one more clip over here. This one's pretty large and usually has quite a bit of force on it. It may not want to come out. If you're going to replace a bearing and that clip isn't going to come out, just give it a little tap in the center of the bearing. You never want to tap the inner part of the bearing. If you're planning on reusing it, you actually damage the race on the bearing. But we're going to go ahead and replace that. Just gotta knock it so it's not up against the clip. And go ahead. This one takes quite a bit of force. Probably a good idea to have safety glasses on when you're removing that. So I'm going to show how to remove the main bearing. Typically, you can just find a very large socket. This is a 1 9/16 inch socket. I do have the factory tools for removing these. Oftentimes, you want to heat up the case and then just dry the bearing out. And trying my best to keep it as square as I can, because once the bearing starts going crooked into the bore, it becomes very difficult and it could possibly damage the case. Some of the other spots that you may find cracks in old engine cases right here. This is a very thin spot right here. I've seen them cracked on parts of where the crankcase go. Like I said, if you're removing the bearings at this point, you probably just replace them. Not really reusable at that point. This is the same situation. You heat this up, but we'll use a smaller socket that fits on the inside. And again, you'll only be hammering on the inner race of that bearing, so you're pretty much destroying that bearing just by the act of removing it. So again, heating it up is going to make the job a lot easier. I got a 1/2 inch long extension and a 1/2 inch socket. And that will suffice for a bearing remover for this rear wheel axle bearing. This one usually comes out pretty easy. Lots of little taps is better than very heavy blows when you're getting the bearings out. And pretty much knock the bearing out. Again, I'm hitting on the inner race, so that does damage the bearing. And you can see the cases are pretty emptied out. At this point, you can clean them. You can usually leave these rubber bushings in there if you're going to clean the cases and reuse them and further inspect them. So we're back to the flywheel side. A couple things we're going to go ahead and remove. You got an O-ring that's located for your Kickstarter, and you could usually use a small knife, or better yet, a small pick tool. But I didn't want to go get my pick tool, but the knife works just as well. Pry the little O-ring out of there, and you have 2 needle bearings. And typically you got to heat these up pretty good, especially this one. And typically they're going to be distorted. So I'd put this on a block of wood right here, find an appropriate size socket that fits in there just perfectly. Or better yet, if you have a set of bearing and seal drivers, you can use those. So I got a 25 millimeter socket, which is kind of an oddball size. And at this point, you could drive the bearing out. But again, the needle bearing on the flywheel side's in there pretty tight, and you're going to have quite a bit of difficulty removing it. I'd suggest warming up the case with either a hot plate, which is probably a safer option, or if you want to do something quick, something like a torch. And you want to keep the torch moving so you spread the heat around into the engine case. Once you have some heat in there, you could take a large socket that happens to fit in there pretty good. This 25 seems like it's working. Everything's pretty hot right now. There we go. So go ahead and lift the case out. Obviously be careful if it's pretty hot. And I drove the bearing out. And you can see it lost some of the needles in the process. Not reusing that. Like I said, this bearing usually lasts quite a long time. If you do need to replace it, there's a special tool to extract it. It's not readily available. I would suggest heating this area up, and you could use a flat chisel to tap it until it drops out. Much easier to install a new one because you could install it up against a flat surface. All right, as you can see, pretty simple engines. Pretty much mostly use basic tools to completely dismantle this engine. And the next step would be cleaning all these parts. Here at the shop, I have a parts washer that has like a degreasing solution that's heated up, and I just scrub all the parts. If you're doing this at home, I'd set up like a little tray. You could use like a flammable solvent or diesel or kerosene, which is pretty dangerous to use. It does clean very well. But I'd recommend mixing up something like Simply Green or Royal Purple and spraying all these parts down and scrubbing them with the wire brush. It's just like doing the dishes essentially, but you're doing it with these parts, and you clean all these parts until you get all the grease and dirt off of them. It's definitely not glamorous, but it's kind of part of the job when you're doing engine rebuild, and you want to inspect all these parts when they're all perfectly clean metal without any of the debris on them or oil. And if you are going to clean them with any type of water solution, I would recommend spraying all the parts down with WD-40, keep them from corroding. Our parts washers has some type of solution in there that doesn't cause rust on the metal parts. And the next step, I'll show you how to inspect everything. We'll replace things like the shifting cross. We'll check the clearances of the piston and the cylinder. And then I'll just kind of prepare and round up all the parts to rebuild it. So look out for the second video. It's gonna be a short video, kind of just inspecting the parts. And the last video will be assemble the motor, and we'll get that motor back in the scooter. All right, well, thanks for watching. Robot here from Scooter West and Vespa Motorsport here in San Diego. If you're just going down that rabbit hole of how to rebuild these motors, I suggest going to the Vespa Motorsport YouTube channel. Just type in the search, go to the channel, and then there's that top bar, and you can go over to search. And we have some of the videos categorized by vintage Vespa. As far as I'm concerned, vintage large frame engines, which is pretty much a 1959 engine, they're all pretty similar. They just have some slight differences. The small frame motor, that's a whole different beast. Some of the wide body motors, which are the piston ported earlier motors or a Vespa GS, those are a little bit different than these. But watch some of my prior videos. I kind of show different techniques. This video, I'm kind of doing the more quick and dirty approach to rebuilding a motor to quickly get through it. So enjoy my videos from the past, and hopefully the new ones help you out. I'll see you on the next one.